This is a lesson on determining a compatible approach, also known as, can I fly this approach? Later on in this video, I'll be using the ILS or localizer runway 13 at San Marcos Regional as my example. You can find the most current version of this approach in your Aero app. Okay, a little bit of background first. Being able to determine if an approach is compatible with our aircraft is kind of a big deal. So we need to be able to do accurately and somewhat quickly. Anytime we talk about takeoff weather, landing weather, alternate airport weather, the phrase that comes up the most is lowest compatible approach minimums. So we need to know what approaches are compatible to make sure that we're looking at the lowest of those minimums. This is a skill that will be evaluated on your check ride. More than likely, your instructor will determine a airport and slide it across the table and say, can I fly this approach? So what he is looking for is for you to be able to look through things and determine if it is compatible. Now, the technique I'm going to show you here is not the only technique for doing that. I'm sure you can get on Google and find a couple dozen, if not a couple hundred different ways to determine this. But the method I'm going to show you is methodical. It flows logically, and it only has 4 steps, so it's easy to remember. First thing we're going to do is look at the title of an approach. Then look at the initial approach fix, chair fly from the initial approach fix to the final approach fix, and then look at the published missed approach. Think of an instrument approach as being made up of 3 main parts, like I have shown in the diagram here. The first part is the initial approach fix to the final approach fix segment. Second segment would be from the final approach fix to the missed approach point, and then the third segment from the missed approach point onward. So step 1, let's take a look at the title of that approach. According to 11217, the title of an approach specifies what equipment we need to fly from the final approach fix to the missed approach point, also known as the final approach portion or the second segment that I had just mentioned on the last slide. So taking a look at the title to see what equipment we need is the very first step in determining if it is compatible. For example, if it has TACAN or NDB in the title, we don't have a TACAN or NDB, so right there we could say, no, this is not compatible. We need to be familiar with 112T6 that talks about our GPS approaches. We can only fly RNAV approaches that have GPS in the title. So if the title said RNAV RNP, we would not be able to fly that approach. A slash means you need both types of equipment. For example, localizer DME, we need localizer equipment and DME equipment. As you can probably guess, if it says or, it means just that. Either this piece of equipment or that piece, either one. An example would be VOR or TACAN. We do not have a TACAN, but we do have a VOR, so we would still be good at that point. 11217, though, says that other nav aids may be required to fly the remaining portions of the approach, which is why we need to look at more than just the title. We need to be familiar with the squadron operating policy because back in attachment 1, it lists the differences between our simulator GPS and the T6 GPS. And that gives us some additional restrictions of what we can accept and what we can do. So we need to be familiar with that. Of course, we want to be familiar with the concept of GPS substitution or alternate procedures. We can find those in 11217 and in 11202. Second step would be to look at the initial approach fix. Take a look in the plan view, look for the letters IAF. There may be more than one. You may have to look a little bit with a lot of the text that may be there in order to find it, but keep looking till you find one. Pick one and use that one for the rest of your determination. We need to take a look at how that IAF is defined. Is it a nav aid? What type of a nav aid is it? Needs to be a compatible nav aid. Is it defined by radial and DME? Is it defined by the intersection of two radials coming off of two different TAC ends, and are those TAC ends compatible? Nav aids, are those compatible? Maybe it has a 5-letter ICAO identifier like Jetty or Jablo. Think about how you would navigate to it and be specific. How would you set up your nav aids en route to the IAF? If you're going to use the GPS to get there, how would you set up your other nav aids for after you get to the IAF? What would you put in the course select window for those other nav aids to be prepared? What about GPS substitution? Make sure you know the restrictions, again, that are listed in the squadron SOP. We may be able to substitute or alternate use some nav aids. Think about how you would do that in detail. The reason we need detail is because we're trying to make sure that all of the procedures and all of the equipment that we're going to rely on are compatible with our procedures and our aircraft. Once you've done that, chair fly from the IAF to the FAF. Again, you need to be very detailed because we're trying to take a look at every step, make sure that we can comply with all the necessary actions, nav aids, and procedures to get to the FAF. So exactly how are you going to get there? What type of an approach is it? Is it a procedure turn, a high-low, procedure track, non-DME teardrop, arc to radial? How would you apply your 11217 procedures? So we need to be very up to speed on what those procedures are. How and when would we change your nav aids? What frequencies? What about descents, pitch and power settings, turns, lead points? What airspeeds would we fly? Think about the checks that you would need to perform while you are navigating from the IAF to the FAF. For example, El Dorado, we might need to do. When are you going to do that? DILs, 6Ts, think about all of those things. As long as we can do these first 3 steps and get from the IAF to the FAF in conjunction with having the equipment for the FAF to the missed approach, this should be a compatible approach. But we do have one more thing to take a look at, and that is the published missed approach. I don't mean a missed approach procedure that's listed in our in-flight guide or word of mouth, but the one that is actually printed and listed on the initial, instrument approach plate. The published missed approach will not prevent us from being able to fly the approach or stop us from declaring it as compatible, but it might require us to coordinate alternate missed approach procedures. So we need to look at that and be prepared. We have to coordinate these alternate procedures before we get to the IAF if we're doing the entire procedure, or before we get vectored onto final if that's what we're getting, vectors to final. We need to make sure we have the nav aids and the performance to fly the procedure. Make sure the radial that's listed doesn't come off of a TACAN or some other non-compatible nav aid for us. If it requires us to fly to a named fix, think about how you would use your GPS to do that. So as long as we can do those first 3 steps, we know what to expect for the missed approach, and if we need to coordinate alternate missed approach, this should be a compatible approach. So let's take a look at an example here using the ILS or localizer to 1-3 at San Marcos. So looking at that title, I need ILS equipment or localizer equipment. I have that in my T6. As far as the note here that says ADF required, we don't have that equipment. I'll leave it up to you to do some research about what that is, but that is in conjunction with an NDB style approach. While we don't have that, we can use GPS substitution for that. So here in step 1 so far, this approach meets our needs. So let's take a look at the second step. The IAF is defined here as Gary's intersection. It is NDB channel 272. It is the lower outer marker. It's also defined as the Centex 215 radial at 33.3 DME. So we have a couple ways that we can identify that. It is the localizer, channel 108.7, with a published front course of 126, but there's no distance or anything else along there to tell us where along that course. So that's not particularly useful for us. But Gary's, that's 5 letters. That is a ICAO named fix. So recommended technique, let's use our GPS, add a waypoint for Gary's, and use the GPS to fly to Gary's. En route, I would want to OBS Gary's, so my GPS will not sequence once I get there. Probably will want to switch back over to VOR mode, put the localizer 108.7 in the VHF nav, put 126, the published front course, in my course select window, nav back into GPS mode so I can continue with my GPS direct procedures. 10 miles out technique, I would want to slow to 150 knots because this is a low altitude approach, and determine which way I'm going to turn when I get to Gary's. All right, third step. We have the equipment in the title. We can identify the IAF. We have a plan for how we're going to navigate to the IAF. So how am I going to get from the IAF to the FAF? Well, by taking a look at this low altitude approach, and you can see that it is a procedure turn. So thinking about my 11217 procedures for how to do procedure turn. When I'm at the IAF, I'm going to turn in the shorter direction to parallel the 126 course outbound. That will be a 306 heading. When I am outbound past a beam Gary's on a parallel or intercept heading, I can start a descent down to 3200. As a technique, 1 degree nose low, 16%, 1,000 foot per minute descent, just like in a vertical S. I want to switch back to localizer mode, so nav back to localizer, and then use a small intercept angle to intercept my 126 course. Level off at 3200, power setting for that, 35%, 2 degrees nose high. Now, one thing I didn't mention is once I am past the beam Gary's, I will want to start my clock because I need to time outbound. Technique is 1 minute for a procedure turn. At the end of my 1 minute, I want to turn right to a 351 heading. I'm going to use a running clock, let it keep going. And when I hit the 2 minute mark, I will then turn left to a 171 heading. Since this is based off of a localizer, once it comes off the wall, I can consider myself established and I can begin my descent down to 2700. As a technique, 16%, 1 degree nose low, 1,000 foot per minute descent to do that, and then turn as required to intercept my final. As I level off at 2700, I'm going to set 35%, 2 degrees nose high. And since I OBS'd Gary's, I know how far out from Gary's I am because I'm coming back to it. When I get to about 3 miles out from Gary's, I'm going to get configured, slow, 145 or less, get my gear, take off flaps, push my power up 35%, 2 degrees nose high, get all trimmed up. Want to make sure that my clock is all set up to do my 6 T's when I get back to it, and I'll switch to tower frequency when approach directs me to do so. So yes, I can get from Gary's the IAF to Gary's the final approach fix. Last step, take a look at the missed approach procedure. It says climb to 2000, then a climbing left turn to 3200, direct Gary's outer marker and hold. So let's think about this. I can climb to 2000 feet. As a matter of fact, when I hit my missed approach point, I'm going to set 10 to 15 degrees nose high, max power, make sure I'm climbing, have a good engine, get my gear up, check my gear and flaps are up. Once I have 120 knots, I'm clean, and I'm at 2,000 feet, I can start a climbing left turn. Continue my climb up to 3,200. I'm supposed to proceed back to Gary's. Well, I OBS'd it so I can roll out with the head of the pink needle under my top index, go back into GPS mode, nav, recenter my GPS by selecting direct to enter, and continue back to Gary's. It says add hold. So my holding airspeed is 150 knots. So as I level off at 3,200 feet, I want to power back 35% approximately and hold my 150 knots, get my clock set up for holding. This is left-hand turns. Oh, excuse me. There we go, left-hand turns. 3,200 feet, so that would be 1 minute legs. And from the direction that I am coming in, it's more than likely going to have me conveniently aligned to do a teardrop entry if I would like. So by reviewing this, I do not need alternate missed approach procedures. So my final answer here, yes, I can fly the localizer, ILS or localizer runway 13 approach at San Marcos Regional. It is a compatible approach. Now notice, I didn't look at all of these other things that I would want to look at if I was actually flying in there. The whole process right now was just to determine if this was compatible. It is compatible. I hope this helps. If you have any questions about how to determine if an approach is compatible, please find one of the instructors in the squadron and get your questions answered. Thank you.